You know, I think I probably said this before by introducing Ethan, but memory is a funny thing, and the older I get, I seem to remember things more vividly that happened a long, long time ago. And I can remember vividly the first time Ethan came to our store, which was over on the corner. He had just published this remarkable collection of short stories called The Emperor of Air. And I think we were one of your first stops at that time on this wide-ranging tour at the time. And Ethan came into the store and just did a remarkable job. That night we've remained good friends. And just about for every one of his books, Ethan has come to the bookshop, which is why this is so sweet, because it's been about 10 years since the last novel, I believe. And so we haven't seen each other much. We got to spend a little bit of time together. And I can tell you, Ethan not only is one of the great writers, but he's really a great person as well and a good friend. And we at Books and Books are just thrilled that this book, A Doubter's Almanac, has received the kind of notices that it has. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the kind of critical reviews and the critical response that it's gotten, I thought I would just read a few. From someone close to us, the late Pat Conroy says of Ethan's book, "With this extraordinary novel, Ethan Canin now takes his place on the high wire with the best writers of his time." Publishers Weekly says, "It's his superb storytelling that makes this novel a tremendous literary achievement." Esquire says, 551 pages of bliss, devastating and wonderful, dazzling. You come away from the book wanting to reevaluate your choices and your relationship. It's a rare book that can do that, and it's a rare joy to discover such a book. And then from the Washington Post, A Doubter's Almanac is a long, complex novel about math, which sounds like the square root of tedium. I like that. But suspend your flight instinct for a moment. Ethan Canin writes with such luxuriant beauty and tender sympathy that even victims of Algebra 2, which I was, will follow his calculations of the heart with rapt comprehension. And to be fair, although the story manipulates complex equations, A Doubter's Almanac really isn't about mathematics so much as a family of mathematicians wrestling with the curse of their own genius. And that's what Ethan does so well. He writes so well about people and their relations. And I hope you'll give a warm Books and Books welcome to Ethan Canin.
Oh, Mitchell. Mitchell is the genius here. I'll tell you what genius is. Genius is books and bikes. Can I spill the beans? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Oh, Mitchell, maybe I shouldn't spill the beans. If there's anything I love more than books, it's bikes. I happen to be a big bicyclist. I live in a town. I live in Iowa City, Iowa, and I have not. In 10 years, I put 5,000 miles on my car. I ride my bike everywhere I go, winter and summer. And I've always thought, bikers they like coffee. A lot of bikers like beer, and they love books. Mitchell, on Friday, right? People were asking me what a genius is today at this presentation. A genius is someone who looks at what everyone else has looked at and sees something new. Mitchell is opening a bookstore called Books and Books and Bikes. It's a bike store and a bookstore, which I think is incredible, Mitchell. It's over in, what's the name of that cool part of town? I can't remember. Wynwood, yeah, it's over in Wynwood, is that right? Yeah, I was, before I came here, I was in that bike store looking at those $8,000 bikes. Bicycles are a beautiful invention, are they not? They're an extraordinary invention, and I would not mind seeing the world revert to bicycles. And this generation, Shane, you're of this generation. You guys don't own cars. You don't buy cars. You don't drive cars. You barely drive them. Anyway, I think that's a great sign for things. So I have to say, so I was on a book tour starting in February, and it ended about 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I'm coming here because I just love Mitchell and Books and Books. And I also have to say that I have had the best day that I've ever had on a book tour. Because I took a long walk. My grandfather and grandmother owned a little condo at 301 Ocean Drive in South Beach, and they sold it in 1970, I think, for about the price of one of those fat tire bikes. And I can remember, I remember when my grandfather died, my father was sitting at the table. It was actually a very important experience for me in my life, because I came down one morning, he was sitting at the table by himself, and I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, my dad died last night." And he said to me, "Life is for the living," which was an interesting experience. He was of that generation that didn't like to show their sadness and didn't like to show their sadness in public, but it was a very gentle, sweet kind of nice piece of advice to give your son. But I remember then in the ensuing weeks, I remember him and his brother, my uncle, arguing over whether to sell that condominium, and my father's brother prevailing. And literally, I think there is a bike across the street that's more expensive than they got. And it's on that, it's turned perpendicular to the beach. Also, I have memories of coming down here as a little kid and going fishing on the pier with my grandfather and catching those, they're not gars, what are they? They look like they have like needle nose. What kind of fish are those? Needlefish. Yeah, and well, are they barracuda? I don't know if that's true. No. Oh, okay. Well, we have a little debate. They're more, well, they weren't like snapping our hands off or anything when we caught them. And I have caught barracuda, and I know that with a barracuda, I believe you put a quarter in it to see if it's poisonous or not. You put it, and if the quarter turns, barracuda can be poisonous certain times of year. There's some chemical reaction. Anyway, enough of that. But I do have these strong memories of being out with my grandfather on this pier and fishing. But what I don't remember is how beautiful the water is. God, it looks, I mean, it's gorgeous. And then I walked all the way up South Beach, back and crossed the Venetian, what do you call that? The causeway, which on the map I was given, with the print was so small, I thought it was the Vietnam Causeway. I thought, that's a strange thing to call it. Anyway, I love this town. It's crazily interesting. It is so energetic. I don't think there's another city in this country that is like this. Maybe New Orleans has its own character the way that Miami does, but it makes New York look sleepy and dull. And New York is all about money now. I mean, so is Miami, but not in the same way. There's such an interesting mix of people here and food and languages. The number of languages I heard walking up, what street was I on? Collins Road. Yeah, walking up Collins. And I don't know, it's very exciting. I know there's problems with the sea encroaching upon your land. I did notice that. And what is the little logo they have lifting up, or what is it, the logo that the government has for raising the streets? It's like rising to the occasion or something like that. It's one of those advertising things. Anyway, so I'm very glad to be here. I'd love to just chat. You know, I'm always interviewed on stage. That's always what they do now on book tours. And I was going to make Mitchell come up here and we could talk about what we've learned in our lives and over these 30 years. But I can also just improvise. I'd love to chat with you guys about anything. I know we have some writers here. This is a novel. It's about, as Mitchell mentioned, it's about a mathematician. Do not be frightened by that, because it's really about ambition and about trying the difficult thing. Any of you enjoy math? Yay. No, there are three, or at least. I might have seen a fourth. Yeah, 4. 3 women and a man. That's unusual. I have a 20-year-old. I have 3 daughters. My 20-year-old was exceptionally good at math, but like lots of girls, she lost her interest in 7th and 8th grade, which just kills me. Or actually, she got to maybe sophomore year in high school before she lost her interest. Thank you for asking a question. Love it. I just happen to love math. When I was a kid, my father had a friend. My father was not an educated man. He never went to college. My mother sort of went to college, not really. She didn't graduate from college. But my father was an autodidact. He's always loved learning. He knows a lot just from reading, And he was friends with a lot of smart people. And when I was a kid, he has friends with a PhD in physics. A guy came over to our house once, and he gave us a problem. He asked my brother and me this problem, which is, you want to hear the problem? It's an old problem. It's if you're given 12 coins, one of which weighs a little different amount from the others, and you have 3 weighings on a balance scale to figure out which the counterfeit is. The counterfeit is one that weighs differently. He gave us that problem. He said this was a problem on his physics graduate student exam, I guess his qualifying exam. And I remember I was about 11 or 12 years old, and all I did was think about that for days on my own. And eventually figured it out. It's harder than it sounds because you don't know whether the coin is heavier or lighter. It's easier if you know whether it's heavier or lighter. That's easy. But it was my first experience with the fact that happiness is concentration. That's what I realized, that happiness in life means concentration. If you can devote yourself to anything, at least to me, that's what happiness is, whatever happiness is. This sense of being fully involved in something, and to me it was something intellectual like that, or in my mind. And I've since then fallen in love with mathematical puzzles. I was an engineering major in college. I started out as an engineering major at least. Until I picked up the collected stories of John Cheever when I was into my freshman year in college and read this. It was just such beauty. And anybody know John Cheever anymore? God, that guy can write. I recently taught a class. I don't like teaching literature. I hate teaching literature. It's one of the banes of my existence, but I had to do it. And I taught a class on Alice Munro, John Cheever, and Raymond Carver as 3 sort of seminal and influential short story writers of the last 50 years. You know some of their work, right? Alice Munro is the greatest writer alive, I think, certainly of short stories. And now that Robertson Davies is dead, perhaps of anything. It's interesting to look at all this stuff 20 or 30 years later. I'm getting away from the math question, but I'll get back to it. Carver did not age well. Carver seems juvenile to me now when I look at his work. You guys know Raymond Carver. He was a very influential writer during my young manhood. Munro held up the best. Cheever didn't quite hold up for me as well as he did then, but in terms of pure athleticism, in terms of pure linguistic athleticism, that is, if you gave every writer in the world the same 100 words to make a paragraph out of, nobody could do what Cheever does. He's a gorgeous writer. He's a rhythmic writer. He writes, the beauty of his prose is from the rhythm of the prose, which is extraordinary, that in a language you can make somebody hear it in a given rhythm. That's one of the few tricks a writer has. So anyway, I was an engineering major. I was studying all the engineering and physics and this stuff, and I just happened to pick up this book of John Cheever stories. And I remember picking up that first story called "Goodbye, My Brother," and reading that opening paragraph from "Goodbye, My Brother," and falling in love with it. And I just decided that's what I wanted to do from then on. I wanted to be a writer, and read all his work, read that whole thick book, and my poor parents. My father is a musician. That's what he does for a living, and I eventually ended up going to medical school, but then I threw it over. And my poor father, who's been in the arts all his life, thinking, what are you doing, giving up a job like being a doctor to write, There's nothing harder, less sure, or more debilitating, I think, to spend your career doing. But anyway, getting back to your question, I've always loved math. It's an incredible thing. You get the sense that I'm an atheist to the core, but there's a debate among mathematicians. I was saying this earlier today about whether math is discovered or invented, right? Whether it's a human invention or whether humans are just glimpsing the language of the universe. And I wholeheartedly come down on the side that it is discovered, because it is so pure. It is absolutely correct. There's no other field. One of the great differences between the humanities and the sciences is that in the sciences, if any of you are trained in the sciences, the simple answer is the correct answer. That's the way nature works. It's called Occam's razor. Anybody heard that term? The solution that requires the fewest number of suppositions, least complexity, is usually the correct answer. And you know it in the sciences when you come across something simple, E equals mc squared, for example. In the humanities, it's the reverse. It's the more complicated answer is the one given the most respect. Which I've never liked. I've always tried to merge that. I've always respected people who can talk about literature or could talk about history in very simple terms. We are rambling. Anybody else want to talk about anything? But I've always loved puzzles. I've since heard a really great puzzle. I'll give it to you quickly, and then if anybody, and then I'll go on. The puzzle is you're given a deck of cards and you're blindfolded. I was giving a reading in Berkeley, California, and two of my high school math teachers came to this, and they gave me a puzzle, and it's a great one. It was actually originally on Car Talk, right? A great source of puzzles. Why is that? Because both those guys graduated from MIT, right? God rest their. One of them has died. Click and Clack. Those were their names. Ray and Tom. Click and Clack. Ray and Tom Magliozzi, I think it is. But so here's the puzzle. Ready for it? And you can think about it. And if you want to email me with the answer, you can find my address on my website, which is ethancanin.com. You're given a deck of cards in which 12 cards have been turned upside down. It's been flipped over, and you're blindfolded, okay? Your job while blindfolded is to separate that deck into two piles such that each pile contains the same number of upside down cards. Got that? Shall I repeat that? You're blindfolded, given a deck of cards in which 12 cards have been turned upside down. Your job, blindfolded, is to separate that deck into two piles such that both piles contain the same number of upside down cards. Okay, now put that out of your mind and think about it later. You can't see the deck. It's nothing tricky like that. You don't rip the cards in half. It's a pure, elegant, logical solution. Nothing tricky. Nothing tricky. It's nothing cheap. Okay? Now I want you to concentrate on what I'm saying now, though. Don't start thinking about that problem. Will you nudge him and make sure he's not thinking about that problem? No, not at all. You just have to blindfold. You have to separate somehow without seeing the cards. You got to separate into two piles that have the same number of cards. 6 and 6 isn't necessarily right. Who said that? That's a supposition. No, I never said it has to be equal. I just said that it doesn't have to be 6 and 6. Each pile has to have the same number of upside down cards. So, yes, ma'am.
I'm interested if you have like a mental catalog of characters, because in Palestine, there's a story of two brothers, and one of them is a mathematical genius.
Very good.
I've taught this story many times, and the students always love it.
Banner, Zag, and Zeralam.
Yeah. Bravery and love, right?
Yeah, courage and I love you is how I
Courage
think of
and
it.
love.
In Hungarian,
Yeah.
which I never let anybody know. How did you find that out?
When you're a teacher, you have to be prepared for students to ask. So I made it my business to know. But
I get a lot of emails from teachers. That book is taught in the New York State public schools, and I get about one email a week saying, "What does the title, The Palace Thief, mean?" Usually by desperate juniors in high school. No, juniors in high school saying my paper's due tomorrow. These kids are so forward now with email. I've had kids write me, and I love this. Like when I read American Pastoral, I wrote Philip Roth a longhand letter and mailed it off to him. Told him how much I loved it, and 6 months later I got a letter back from him. Blah blah blah. This kid writes me and says, we have a paper due on your story tomorrow. I forgot my book in school. Do you have an extra copy of?
oh my God.
That's this generation. What can you? I sent him a PDF of the story because I just thought he had so much chutzpah. But he's sorry. So you were saying about?
Wondering if those characters somehow stay with you and then they come back in a novel like this.
That's interesting because that story is about a math prodigy. I believe it or not, I wrote this whole 600-page book. It's 600 pages, 560-something pages. It was about 800 manuscript pages, without realizing that the two are related. I never thought of that, but yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, there must be something. I had a great uncle who was a mathematician when I was a kid, and he had encountered a lot of difficulties in his life, and that was some of the motivation for this story, for this novel. But I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, how many of you have written a novel? Would you characterize it as easy, medium, or difficult?
Excruciatingly hard.
Excruciating hard. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. And that's putting it lightly. There's nothing more difficult. I mean, it is brutally difficult to write a novel, to invent everything, to keep people interested in it, to remember the names of the characters so that they have the same names at the beginning and at the end, to know where you're going. I'd say of the elements of fiction writing, which you can loosely describe as, nice language is one of them. Most people who try to write a novel can write decent prose, or they wouldn't be trying it. But in some ways, that's the easiest part. And there's say again. The nice language is not so easy. Is that what you're saying? I couldn't hear what anybody said. Anyway, so the nice language is easy for most writers. The idea of characterization, that's a tricky one. That's a little harder. And how you characterize is actually a trick of writers. But the most difficult thing for most serious fiction writers is plot, right? And telling a story in a way that will interest people, something will be revealed that is both, as Aristotle said and 2,000 years ago, so that the ending is both surprising and inevitable. Incredible advice about how to write fiction is excruciatingly difficult. And I've been writing for about 30 years. I've learned between 13 and 14 things about fiction writing, and it's just perfect for me because I teach a 14-week semester. I teach at the University of Iowa at the Writers' Workshop, and I give them each a little lecture every week. And one of the lectures I give about plot, I think I give maybe 2 or 3 good lectures. One of them is about plot, and one of them is about characterization. And maybe I only give 2 good lectures now that I think of it. But the way to make a plot that I finally learned, I only learned this year, after 30 years of wondering how the hell you do this, is bad behavior. That's what novels are. They're compendiums of bad behavior. Literature is the gossip about that behavior. And that's what it is. Think of a story that does not involve bad behavior. It all involves bad behavior. Someone doing what he or she is not supposed to do, and the consequences of that. Often it involves secrecy. Often that bad behavior engenders other bad behavior. Shane, you can take this to the bank, man. Just don't tell your colleagues until you're done with your book. People misbehave. That creates problems. That creates the complication that will create a book-length plot. As they work to either hide what they've done, and then I look back at all the books I've written, and they've all involved that. But I didn't realize that. So it's anyway. Writing is difficult. That makes it a little bit easier. Yes, ma'am.
When you start to write, do you know what's going to happen with your characters, or does it evolve as?
Have you ever written a novel? A short story? Maybe. The question was, I don't know if y'all heard it. Do I know what's going to happen? No, I have no idea. I didn't know this was going to be a book about a mathematician. I didn't know that story was going to happen in that story, that Battersag and Zarlem story that you know. I think if you know it, your readers are as intelligent as you are, and they are not crippled. They are not crippled by having to, to tell this story through symbolic language and, black marks on a page. They don't have to show anything. So if you set out to teach your reader something, I've had students come up to me and say, I want to write a novel that shows that love is the obverse of, and I just say, don't do that. You're making a big mistake. Do you know who David Milch is? Anybody? He's a TV writer. He created a lot of famous TV shows like Hill Street Blues, like NYPD Blue, like Deadwood, which I found absolutely dreadful, but some people just adore. Anyway, he's an interesting guy, very well-read human being, and he was recently speaking, and it might not be his idea. I heard him give a talk, and he said, it's a lot easier to plot your way into an idea than it is to idea your way into a plot. And I was just sitting there speaking with one of my students who had graduated, and he was saying he wants to write a novel in which he takes the idea of tapestries, of interwoven tapestries of knowledge, the way the Greeks have, and makes a modern version of that. And I said, no, you just can't do that. You got to write a story about a guy who walks down to the bay and steals a boat and gets in it, and see what happens from there. And all those ideas are going to come from there, right? If you can mimic human behavior, you can't write a book of metaphors. You can't write a book of similes. You just have to write realistic human behavior, and that's where the metaphors come from. They come from realistic human behavior. That's, the sea does not represent hope or fertility because Harold Bloom says it does. It represents it because that's what it is. When I'm walking along Vietnam Way there, crossing. And I'm looking into the sea. There's an incredible feeling. Not because Harold Bloom says that, because humans are drawn to the sea. And there's something about that. Yes, I live in Iowa City, Iowa.
Is it the case? I read the book incidentally, and it was a wonderful book.
Thank you.
I loved the protagonist, and I hated the fucker when I was finished.
Yeah.
Okay. But I have a question for you. Is it the case that now that people are writing on computers, that novels are becoming much, much longer?
Did you say longer?
Longer.
Yeah, can you all hear that question? Here's the question. After some kind words about the book, he said about writing on the computer. Is it because of the computer that novels are getting longer? Well, in some ways, maybe that's true. I actually think the internet, not the computer, but the internet has made a difference in that you can research anything now. I mean, the way to get yourself into a mood to write is to look at a picture. You know, if you want to write about silver mining in the Andes, if you look at a picture of an Andean silver mine, you can produce everything in your own mind after that. So the internet has made that infinitely easier. So there's a tremendous burst in outward imagination. People are, you know, first of all, every kid in his 20s, I know this because I read the applications to the Iowa Writers Workshop, is writing a post-apocalyptic novel. It's you know, it's scary, and I feel for those kids because of particularly global warming or global climate change is something that's scaring the daylights out of that generation, and they're writing about it. There's been a huge boom in outward imagination. Novels are about everything. They take place, you know, in all kinds of crazy situations. I sometimes think there's a lack of inward imagination that's occurring now. Or that's maybe the young people can't. It's very difficult for a young person to write an inwardly imaginative book because they don't have the experience to do that. And you know, they tend to write bold, you know, strutting, world-walking books when they're younger, and more serious, you know, books about what it's like to be alive and to suffer loss and to suffer all the pain. I mean, there's such a tremendous amount of difficulty in the world. You know, any single life is full of a tremendous amount of sadness and worry and anxiety and loss. It's also full of beautiful things, but you can't get past a certain age without realizing that. And for kids, it's difficult to do that. It's the rare young writer who can do that. And I've seen one or two of them come through who have that sense from a young age. But mostly the internet is good for that outward imagination. And in some ways, it doesn't do anything for the inward imagination. Writing, fortunately, is not an art of prodigies. You know, generally, as a writer, you get better as you get older, as you experience things. Yeah, it's George.
I like the idea that what makes and drives a good plot is bad behavior.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's explaining a whole lot of things.
Yeah,
And
everything.
then so it's almost a recent discovery for you. Absent engaging in bad behavior yourself and passing it off as research for your novel, what do you recommend for writers in order to get those ideas, and rather than these intellectual ideas that you try to make into a plot?
Yeah.
How do you come up with the stories, the terrible human stories that can be workable as a
Yeah, well, I recommend working as a football coach, for example, for a while. I'd say that because I'm poor Shane has been called on the carpet now 3 times. Shane is a football coach as well as a writer. That's the kind of experience you need to work. I was a doctor, which was an incredible experience to be a writer. I mean, every hoodlum in the book. I worked in a public emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital during the height of the AIDS epidemic. So I was pronouncing 1 or 2 kids dead per night there in the mid-1990s. And a lot of these kids were gay kids who'd come to San Francisco from the Midwest, not having told their parents they were gay, and then dying alone, and still not being able to tell their parents, which is very, and that's probably in some ways where that story came from. Remember that story you were talking about, Battersog and Zaralam? Yeah. But yeah, that kind of experience is fantastic for doing it. You know, I don't know, I tell my kids, I want to teach a class in which we follow a cop around for a day, we go visit with dying people for a day, you go work with a construction worker for a day. That's the kind of experience. You go, how could you go witness an unhappy marriage? It'd be a nice thing to be able to do as a bunch of students. Or to see loss, to see the worry one has over one's children, which, never goes away, right? Am I right? Yeah. They don't tell you that when you have them. But that's the kind of experience that makes for the inward imagination that only comes with many, many years. When you're young, I think you try to write a book that's good. And when you're older, you try to write a book that's true. And I think that's, and unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily, would you say that translates to lower sales, Mitchell? You look so familiar. Do I know you? But I've seen you in other readings. Yes, I have. Come on.
Ride your bike across the Venetian Causeway?
I was going to, but I thought I was going to get a city bike because and I didn't because I wanted to walk because I thought it was more exercise. Miami it's so flat here. You can't get any exercise on your bikes. Now that the city is being raised a little bit, you get a little bit of, there's a hump every now and then.
We have an 80-foot bridge. That's
80-foot elevation?
yeah.
Wow, go up and down that 10 times a day. Where I live in Iowa is a hell of a lot hillier than it is here in Miami.
You say you come up with your ideas as you're writing. So what did you sit down with? Is it, okay, it's time to write a book, and you sit down with a blank piece of paper? Or how do you have the character or a character in mind? And
Well, like, for example, this
how did
book.
it evolve from the beginning?
Yeah, it's a frightening proposition. I usually have 2 books going at once because I know I'm going to hit the wall on one book, and I won't be able to. And I'll just this book. I went out with my friend and said I can't write it. I can't finish it. I had written 500 pages. It felt like a mess to me. I said I got to give the money back to Random House. They already given me this money. I'd paid my taxes on it. I'd spent a lot of it. I was going to have to give it back to them, and he sort of talked me down and got me through it. But this is the only book I've ever written in which the first scene I wrote ended up being the first scene in the book. Every other book has changed dramatically, and I probably should have taken this first scene out, but I kept it in there. But no, it's a process of discovery because you're not smart enough to dictate anything to anybody. You have to discover in medicine they used to say, I've said this on a number of book readings and nobody understands it. I'm still hoping somebody will understand it. In medicine, the expression is the dumbest kidney is smarter than the smartest internist. The dumbest kidney is smarter than the smartest internist. Meaning you spend a lot of time like dosing a drug. This guy weighs 68 kilograms. He's 82 years old. His glomerular filtration rate is blah, 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 blah. Should we give him this? Doesn't matter. The kidney will figure it out and get rid of the drug he doesn't need. The way that relates to writing is that your unconscious knows psychology better than you will ever figure it out. And your job as a writer is just to unbridle that. Is to let it go. And it's almost a physical thing. Like when I sit down to write, I spend a few moments before I write actually like letting go of myself and not trying to direct it, trying to hear voices, which, the whole process of thought, I've been thinking about this as I wrote this book, the whole process of thought is a mystery. Like we think of thought as being synonymous with language, but it's not at all. Like you can tell somebody what you've been thinking afterwards by using language, but the whole process of thought occurred in a microsecond. Like as I was walking down the street to this shop, I was judging the danger or non-danger of everybody I saw. What cars were near me, whether I could cross the street, all these things that are occurring below the level of verbal thought. If you asked me what I was thinking, I could tell you, but that's not how I was thinking it at the moment. So I think as you mature as a writer, one of the things you try to do is try to find language that most closely approximates thought. So writers tend to start dropping out articles like the and a, and verbs, and often writing in imagistic sentences. The street, dusk, rain, that kind of thing, which is an attempt to approximate thought, which is an attempt. I think it represents the attempt by the writer to become the character he's writing about rather than to be a writer. So that, to me, feels like the ultimate goal that a writer ought to be striving for is to remove that barrier between experience and language, or try to get it as close together as possible. It's what poets do. Poets, language is the great hindrance to poets. They're trying to get as close to the experience of living, which is metaphorical, as close to the experience of thinking as possible. And anybody's ever tried anything in the science is aware of intuition, right? You're working on a difficult problem and suddenly something flashes past your brain and you think, oh fuck, that was the answer. I don't know why, but I know that was the answer. I haven't figured it out yet. And that's this thing that's happening below the level of cognition. And it's very interesting. It's like there's a machine encased, your skull encases a machine, and we only hear the little beeps and grinds of that machine. And that's what language is, and that's what we try to interpret. But there's a whole thing going on underneath there. And intuition is really probably that logical process that's going on in your brain that is below the level of language. That's what I would suspect to be true. Yeah.
As the book unfolds, the torment of your hero is exactly in a way what you're talking about now, the search for understanding, meaning. And he can never quite get it. And even when he gets it, without giving away the plot. But it's that same kind, what you're describing for yourself is the feeling I got from him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this book is about a mathematician, but it could be about somebody. Someone once said, which I just heard recently, every novel is about writing a novel, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of an obvious relation, I suppose, to see. But yeah, this book is about, in some ways, about trying the difficult thing, trying the impossible thing. And God knows writing a novel is the impossible thing. As I believe Flaubert might have said, a novel is never finished, merely abandoned. And it's about doing anything. It's just trying the impossible thing, whether that be opening a bookstore in this era, which I also have to congratulate Mitchell. I mean, every bookstore in this city has, all the big bookstores have closed, and you're the little, yeah. But anyway, it's about trying the difficult thing. It's about doing the impossible. And why do we want to do such things? I do not know. What is the human drive to do that? You know, maybe that has been selected for. Maybe it's, you know, whatever humans had that drive have somehow outlived or outgrown their initial numbers in the species, because there's something about that drive that leads to a greater life for the rest of us.
Really high-level math theory to someone who knows no high-level math theory.
Yeah.
So you're creating the same kind of challenge.
Yeah.
Trying to understand what is he talking about.
But you can read. I hope you can. Can you hear this? I hope you can read the book not knowing any math. I mean, I don't understand this math. Just to clear things up, I do not understand half the math. I cannot read a paper in topology. He's a topologist, which is what? It's a study. It's sort of a super modern geometry. It's a study of shapes and how they keep certain properties and lose certain properties. As they're stretched and bent. And in topology, you can stretch anything you want, but you can never cut it and you can never glue it. Those are the only rules. So a donut is the same as a coffee cup to a topologist, right? Yes, ma'am.
I do have a question, but I just would like to comment on, very moved by your thoughts of the inner person.
Yeah.
You sound much more like the academia of my day, the 1950s and the 60s.
What field were you in?
What I'm a gerontologist. Than what I know, because I'm highly involved, of the academia today.
Are you talking about medical academia or? Yeah.
But just in general, the lack of the emphasis on the humanities, the inner soul, is not the modus operandi of most academic.
Yeah.
But I do have a question.
Yes.
In this
I should also say that I happen to love gerontology. We need more gerontologists.
We have plenty of old people to serve.
And old people are so much. I love old people. I mean, as I've given a lot of book tours. We're here. And it's so much better speaking to a group of people who are 50 and older. That is, speaking to a group of college students is terrible. Yes.
Sitting in this room, I have heard a number of very well-known authors.
Right.
All with the same comment. They do not plan out the ending of their books, and this was Allende and Dr. Owen, I can mention others.
Yeah, Dr. was a fantastic
I'm
writer.
very cynical about that. I can't believe that. How do you handle?
I fully agree with them. I would never. Did you hear the question about plotting out the end of your book? I would never do such a thing. I mean, maybe that's what literary writing is. Is you're not. It's not. The plot is secondary to the exploration of character, and I would never do it. I heard John Irving once say that he always writes his books towards one line, and he writes that line before he writes the book, and he puts it in front of his typewriter. And the line in The World According to Garp, which many of you might remember, was something. I remember when I forget the character's names now. They catch the rapist, and the guy's a muscle man, and he picks up the rapist and holds him over his head. And the line was, and that's all you can do with somebody like that. You pick him up and hold him over your head, and then you put him down. No, I don't at all. I think Irving is full of shit. I think he was making that up. I think he was saying that. No, I think he's a wonderful writer, but I think he was just saying that to throw off those in pursuit. Yeah, I would never know the end. If the ending is not a surprise to you, it's not a surprise to the reader. That's my general experience. No, don't do that. I mean, I love cynicism. Cynicism is what makes the world go round. Holly, and then you. Yes.
So I'm such a groupie. I already heard him speak once today. And you recommended a book called *Sapiens*, which we're going to go.
Yes, *Sapiens*. Mitchell, you got to sell this book. Anybody read *Sapiens*? This new book that's out. I'm only about 100 pages into it, but it is fabulous. It's a history of humankind, written by an Israeli historian, and in just in the first chapter or two, I've learned 4 or 5 things, which is extraordinary.
What else you recommend? I find authors are great recommenders.
Great recommenders. You know, I haven't read a piece of fiction that I've really liked in a while, because there's something about there's a current trend of the writer being the number one most important person in the room, which I don't really like. You know, the writers who have the same names as their characters, and the prose it's all about the prose. You know, I hate to say it, but probably the last novel I read and really liked, I probably read 3 or 4 years ago, and it was written actually coincidentally by my boss at the University of Iowa, a woman named Samantha Chang. It's called All Is Forgotten, Nothing Is Lost. And that's not me, you know, take it or leave it. It's about a writer. Not everybody likes it, but it felt very true to me, and I'm interested in that right now. I'm trying to think of what others, and I can't even think of a book I've read. Other than *Sapiens*, has really had a tremendous impression on me.
Read other people's fiction while you're writing your fiction, because that would be a long since.
Well, I teach, so I read a lot of fiction. I spend a lot of my week reading fiction. But yeah, I do not like to read fiction. I'm a nonfiction reader, generally speaking. I like to learn when I read, or I like to read books in which I learn. I mean, I'll tell you some of the great books that I've read in my life. I think the Deptford trilogy by Robertson Davies is an extraordinary set of books. I think Sacred Hunger by Barry Unsworth. Anybody know that book? That has a Florida element to it. Is an extraordinary book. I think some of Philip Roth's work, like American Pastoral, that I mentioned, is a great book.
Love that book, and my son and I were like, what? You read the book about the gloves?
Oh, the gloves. I love that. The glove making in New Jersey. That's anyway, so those are some of my favorite books. I mean, any of the selected stories of Alice Munro. Oh God, the great British short story writer William Trevor is a great short story writer. If anybody knows doesn't know William Trevor's work, he and Alice Munro, I think, are the 2 great story writers alive today. Anything else we talk about? I don't know how long these things go. Mitchell, we keep going. Yes, Shane.
There are many, I'll say, guidelines to stay away from the word rules as far as...
Did you say rules?
I can say rules. Okay, there are many rules for aspiring writers.
Yeah.
And for instance, like, no one wants to read a story about a writer, but Samantha Chang defined that, right? And write what you know. But based on the conversation here, it seemed like you didn't know a lot of the subject matter.
Yeah, the write what you know thing is, I don't know about that. Ken Kesey once said, write about what you don't know about what you do know, which is kind of an interesting place to be. So I would always say, write about what you don't fully understand. There's some darkness. If you can sense, it's the intuition thing. You can sense something psychologically dark and true somewhere in the distance. You can't name it. And a book ought to be an exploration of that in which you do not find the answer. A book ought to be an exploration of that, in which the answer remains a puzzle to you, but remains of interest to you as a writer. The writing what you know thing, I think, can really lead people in a lot of bad directions, because I think people misinterpret that to mean you need to write a novel about a 21-year-old deciding whether to major in English. I think that's done a lot more harm than good. I think imagination is the rarest of all the commodities it takes to be a writer, especially psychological imagination. And I think a lot of that comes from reading. It comes from not watching TV. It comes from not doing the things that control your imagination. Like, I hate to say it, TV controls your imagination. There's very little you can add to that. It's visual, it's oral. Movies do too. Music doesn't. I listen to music when I'm writing often, music without words, because I think that there's something that frees your imagination. I like long distance driving because it frees your imagination, especially with a stick shift car, because it takes just enough mechanical dexterity that it releases the brakes on your imagination. So anyway, the write what you know thing is dangerous. Yes, ma'am.
I grew up at a time when I watched, oh, I'm sorry, where I listened to radio, and I listened to Let's Pretend.
Yeah.
And it was fairy tales that you created the world in your mind. I wonder if young people today, a lot of kids don't read anymore, and they use all these technological things. Everything is there for them.
Yeah.
Do they use the imagination the way they should be? Do they do it? I mean, there are some.
That's the question of the age. That is the question of the age. What effect is this going to have on the imagination in certain ways? I know that I have 3 children, all of sort of the internet age. The oldest is a Luddite of the first order. She has no cell phone, doesn't do any of this stuff. She's intentionally taken herself out of this world, and so have some of her friends. She's 20, she's 19, so there's some of that going on. I watched the Super Bowl this year, and just as a little experiment, we timed how long each shot was held, and there was one shot that was held for a very long time. We were all sort of amazed that the camera stayed on one image for such a long time, and that was 3 seconds. All the others were in the order of a second and a half. And does that? I don't know. I think people still love to read, though. I mean, we get a zillion applications to the Iowa Writers Workshop. People still want to tell stories. They still want to read physical books. I mean, all of us here probably prefer physical books, I would guess. I asked my class of 35 people the other day, how many of you primarily read on an e-reader? And you know how many of them raised their hands? 0. And that's, so they're in some ways they're smarter than they look. But the book is a great friggin' technology. It's an unbelievable technology. It's all this information. It's in your hand. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't get stolen. The batteries don't run out. You can read it even as you ascend in an airplane. Yes. Yeah.
Which I enjoyed, but it also meant that no matter where I was reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just compelling. I never was allowed to take a break.
Yeah.
In the doctor's office.
Yeah, well, I thank you for that. I mean, that's great. And my book is kind of heavy to hold above your head. It's hard to read in bed. So there is the downside to that. But what's interesting is that there's really no explicable reason why people care about stories. Why they do, but they do. You want to know what happened. You want to know what other people's lives are like. I was once on stage and with it being interviewed, and I sat down at the Kansas City Public Library, large audience, and the interviewer turned to me and said, first question, what is the purpose of literature? Which, try answering that with no preparation. And out of my mouth came, it's a rehearsal for death, which is it's interesting. It's not exactly right, but it's a rehearsal for life. I mean, you get to live 100 other lives. You get to see what other people have done under these similar circumstances. And that's a very powerful force in the culture. To see, how other people deal with what you have to deal with. Yes, ma'am.
Do you read your reviews, and how do you feel about them when the reviewer doesn't seem to get what you were trying, or what you think you were putting out?
It takes many years to learn how to deal with that kind of stuff. It's very hard when you're a young writer and you get a bad review. After a while, you just have to write for the people that you do connect with. I mean, no book is for everybody. You guys disagree vehemently over American Pastoral. I know Philip Roth is upset that you don't like his book, and you found. I'm going to tell him. You have to. But you have to, and you agree. So the two people here don't like his book, but I happen to adore that book. You just have to write for the people you connect with. And my favorite writers in the world, like Saul Bellow, for example, who I think was the greatest writer of the last century, of the 20th century, American writer. I like 2 of his books. So it's not as though you're going to write like everything that a writer writes. There's always going to be that variation. But critics, what can you do with them? You want to shake them sometimes. What do you mean?
You write 2 books at the same time?
Oh yeah, well, I'm still writing it. I have a 2-book contract, so I have to start a 3rd book so that I can write the second one. I got about 75 pages of it. It's going to be short and easy and not about math. Yeah, 8 years between pub dates. It takes that long. I mean, if you write 500 words a day, which is not that hard, writers are lazy. If you write 500 words a day, which takes about an hour and a half, you're Joyce Carol Oates. That's 2 books a year. If you can make them good, those 500 words. Yeah.
This that you talked about when we had a conversation, and it goes to what you're talking about here tonight. And that has to do with creation and satisfaction.
Ah,
The
yes.
advice that you gave your
Yes. I was going to tell you, it's so interesting you said that, because my 16-year-old, for some strange reason, which I cannot figure out, I'm still wondering about it, she asked me for advice the other day. I don't know if she was drunk or or something had happened. I think she had maybe recently broken up with a boyfriend. But she asked me, she said, what should I be when I grow up? Like, what should I... And of course, my tail was wagging. But I didn't want to overstep. So I thought about it. I said, I think the most important thing I found in my life is always to be making something. If you can always be making something in your life, I think that is the key to, I don't know if happiness is the word, but it's the key to some kind of sense of well-being in the world. So I just said, whatever you do, make sure you're making something. And I think that's true. I found that to be the case. And I'm glad, in a sense. I mean, leaving medicine was hard for me. I left this very secure job for a very insecure one. But God, I get to make something every day, which is incredible. And you get to open a new bookstore. And, you are always turning, Mitchell, you are always turning to make something new. And that's because you understand that. That gives life force. Yes. Yes. And thank you all for coming. Happy to meet you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. And those of you watching it online, Ethan can sign a book for you too. All you got to do is call the number on the screen and tell them that you'd like Ethan to sign a book for a new will. And we will send it to you free of charge. Shipping free of charge, not the book free of charge. The shipping will be free of charge. In any case, thank you all for coming. Beautiful evening. We'll see you again soon.